33 this evening. Genesis chapter 33. Last week, Jacob decided to leave Laban's home and ran away from Laban, and then Laban kind of caught up with them, and they kind of had it out, and then sort of made a covenant. And then Esau and Jacob were coming to meet one another, and Jacob was preparing for that by sending gifts and things ahead of him. And so now, here in chapter 33, it says that Jacob lifted his eyes, and he looked, and there Esau was coming, and with him were 400 men. And you remember, that's all that Esau told him when that Jacob had said, "I'm coming to meet you." And the servant came back and said, "He's coming with 400 men." And Jacob thought, well, this is it. He's coming with his army to take vengeance on me. And so this was his plan in verse 1. He divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the two maidservants. And so he put the maidservants and their children in the front and sent them ahead before the others. And then he put Leah and her children behind. And then very last, he put Rachel and Joseph together and sent them as sort of the caboose. And I guess the idea is if Esau starts to attack the first group, then the others will hear or know about it in some way, and they'll run away. They'll get to safety somehow. And of course, we know Rachel is in some ways his favorite wife. Also, Joseph is the smallest child, and so in that sense, too, putting him in the very back. And so, verse 3, he crossed over before all of them, though. And so he kind of put them in order and gave them instructions. And then he went in the front, and he bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. And so he didn't send any kids ahead of him, hoping that there'd be time for all of them to get away. But that's kind of how he chose to do that. And so he humbles himself. He bows down before his brother. And then perhaps he was surprised. It seems like he wasn't expecting Esau to run to meet him and to embrace him. And he fell on his neck and he kissed him and they wept. And so it really, in a way, reminds me of the prodigal son and his father, and how the prodigal son comes and he's not really expecting his dad to be happy to see him, much less for his dad to sort of fling his arms around his neck and kiss him and just be so excited to see him. And so you have this sort of touching reunion. In verse 5, Esau lifted his eyes and he saw the women and the children, and he said, "Who are these with you?" And so he said, "These are the children whom God has graciously given your servant." And you think it's been 20 years since they've seen each other. And in that time, Jacob has accumulated 4 wives and 12 children. And that's a lot of nieces and nephews that Esau doesn't even know exist, and that he's meeting for the first time here. And so the maidservants came near, they and their children, and they bowed down. And Leah also came near with her children, and they bowed down. And then afterward, Joseph and Rachel came near, and they bowed down. And Esau said, "What do you mean by all this company which I met?" And he said, "These are to find favor in the sight of my Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." And so you have these two brothers who just the last time they saw each other, they're fighting over who should get the birthright and who should get the blessing. They're fighting over what possessions that they're going to own someday. And today, Jacob tries to give Esau things, and Esau doesn't even want it anymore. He said, I have enough for myself. I don't want to take yours. But Jacob says, "No, please, if I have now found favor in your sight, then receive my present from my hand, inasmuch as I have seen your face, as though I had seen the face of God, and you were pleased with me." Now, the comment about the face of God, it's sort of the idea, and really it goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 4. And you remember in Genesis chapter 4 how both Abel and Cain brought an offering to God. And it says that God accepted Abel's offering, but he did not accept Cain's offering. And in the original language, and it says he does not accept, what that literally means is he didn't look at it. He turned his face away from that offering. And he didn't accept it because he refused to even look at it. And so it's sort of the idea of the face of God is if it's pointed at you, then you know that things are good. And if he won't look at you. And so in essence, what he's saying is he feels that Esau has the right to judge him for his actions. And he feels relieved that Esau chooses to look at him. He chooses to embrace him and be pleased with him instead of judge him for the actions that he had done. And so he verse 11, he continues, please take my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough. And so he urged him, and so Esau went ahead and took it. And that, in essence, Jacob is kind of trying to make, what do they call it? Retribution, or he's trying to make amends. That's a good way to put it. He's kind of trying to return some of what he feels like he took from Esau. And so, you know how it is sometimes when someone wants to give you something, you don't want to take it, but you okay, all right. And that's Esau goes ahead and takes what Jacob gives him. And so then Esau wants to spend more time. He says, let's take our journey and let's go, and I will go before you. But Jacob said to him, my Lord knows that the children are weak, and the flocks and the herds which are nursing are with me. And if the men should drive them hard one day, all of the flock will die. And so please let my Lord go on ahead before his servants, and I will lead on slowly at a pace which the livestock that go before me and the children are able to endure until I come to my Lord in Seir. And that's, remember, the promised land, and then south of the promised land was the land of Seir, or what would eventually become known as the land of Edom, which is Esau's descendants. And so he says, I don't want to slow you down getting back to your people. We'll go at a more leisurely pace. But verse 15, Esau says, well, then let me leave with you some of the people who are with me. And he says, but Jacob says, what need is there? Right, look at all of my help. I've got plenty of help. Let me find favor in the sight of my Lord. And so, again, you have these two brothers, and once again, in a sense, they're arguing with each other again. But instead of, what can I get, right? They're like those super polite people who argue about who's going to go inside the door first. No, you go. No, let me help you. No, let me help you. And so they're arguing, but it's so much different than it was before because they've matured and they've changed over the past 20 years. They're trying to put each other first and to rebuild this relationship that was so broken. And so verse 16, Esau returned that day on his way to Seir, and Jacob journeyed to Succoth, built himself a house, made booths for his livestock, and therefore the place of this name is called Succoth, which that means booths or shelters. Right? He built some kind of tents for them there, and that's why they named it that. And then finally, Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Padan Aram, and he pitched his tent before the city. And he bought the parcel of land where he had pitched his tent from the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money. And then he erected there an altar and called it El Elohe Israel. And so he's finally back in the land that he promised he would come back to. Now, not all the way to Bethel yet, but to the Canaan land. And sort of as a sign that he trusts in God's promises, that someday this land will belong to his descendants, he purchases a small piece of it. Now, not very much, but a small piece of it, he purchases it as if to say, I know that we're going to own this land someday, and so I'm investing in this. And he purchases it so that he can build an altar there. And so that's the idea. He's going to make some kind of sacrifices to God now that he's arrived in Canaan. And then he calls the altar El Elohe Israel, which simply means God, the God of Israel. Now remember, in the previous chapter, he wrestled with this man who appears to be God, and he changes Jacob's name. He says, no longer will you be called Jacob, but you'll be called Israel, which means Prince of God. And so he builds this altar, and he names it God is the God of Israel. He is finally ready to say, you are my God. When he left the Canaan, he said, if you do these things for me, if you take care of me and bring me back safely, then you will be my God. And so now he's really ready to make him his God. And that's the significance of naming the altar that way there. Okay, any thoughts or comments on chapter 33? All right, as we get into chapter 34 then, and just one last thought before we move on though. So remember we had talked about last week that this was, of course, written to the first audience being the Israelites with Moses. And remember how they struggled to believe that God could do all that he promised, and that they ended up not going into the promised land and had to wander for 40 years. And you notice what Moses has built into this story. Jacob leaves the Canaan land, just like Jacob does later. He goes to Egypt, he leaves the Canaan land, and then he comes back to it, and he's very afraid to. He's afraid of Laban, who, he's not sure. He says, I didn't know if you would take my wives and children from me. And then he's afraid of Esau coming into the land, afraid that Esau is going to destroy all of his family. But God keeps him safe from Laban. Remember, he comes to Laban in a dream and he says, don't touch him, right? Don't speak good nor evil about this. And then Esau forgives him when he gets into the land. And so God works that out too. And there's kind of this parallel of God's done this before. He's taken Jacob out and brought him back into the land before. And so now that we're leaving Egypt, remember they were kind of afraid of Pharaoh. But now that we're leaving Egypt and getting ready to go into the land, if he's done it before, then he can do it now. And so there's this encouragement for the first generation, or maybe even just for the second generation, that they could do it because God had done it before. Yes, sir?
Is this the first time the children of Israel had heard of or knew of the past and the generations that came from Abraham? Or had those stories been passed down before God had Moses write them for them?
I want to say that when you get into the book of Exodus, and as you read those first few chapters, that some of these things at least seemed familiar to them. And that's like any family, they would have passed down oral traditions. And so as far as, all of these details, or all the way back to creation or things like that, some of that might have been a little bit new to some people, but a lot of these things would have been somewhat familiar to them, because just like any family, they're just going to pass down those stories. And so, yeah, that's a good question. Okay. All right. Chapter 34 then is really a sort of a sad story as you go through here, and it's about his daughter. And we know that he had 10 sons, and then he had a daughter named Dinah, and then he had a son, Joseph, after that. And Dinah is one of Leah's children. And it says that Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. Now, it doesn't really say one way or another whether this was a good idea. I know my gut instinct for when we read the Bible about these things is, she's going to spend time with idol worshipers, and so is that really a wise idea or not? And my gut instinct is to think that maybe that wasn't where she should have been. But it doesn't really pass judgment one way or another here in the text. It just tells us that she did it. And it says that when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, and he's the prince of the country, and so you kind of get the idea that maybe he's the kind of person where when he wants something, he just kind of gets it. He's the prince of this country. Someday, if he lived long enough, he was going to be the ruler of this area. He saw her, and he took her, and he lay with her, and violated her. But his soul was strongly attracted to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the young woman, and so he spoke kindly to this young woman. And so Shechem then went to his father, Hamor, and he says, "Give me this young woman as a wife." And then, of course, he's gone out of order here, and this is not the way that he should have gone about making her his wife. And so Jacob heard that he had defiled Dinah, his daughter, and his sons were with his livestock in the field. And so Jacob held his peace until they came. And then Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. And the sons of Jacob came in from the field when they heard it. And the men were grieved and very angry, because Shechem had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, a thing which ought not to be done. And so they recognize and are very upset for their sister, what had happened to her. But Hamor spoke with them, saying, "The soul of my son Shechem longs for your daughter, and please give her to him as a wife, and make marriages with us, and give your daughters to us, and take our daughters to yourselves. And so you shall dwell with us, and the land shall be before you. Dwell and trade in it, and acquire possessions for yourselves in it." And Shechem himself, he's basically begging at this point. It says, "Let me find favor in your eyes, and whatever you say to me, I will give. Ask me ever so much dowry and gift, and I will give according to what you say to me. But give me the young woman as a wife." And so he's willing to give any sized dowry to appease their anger and to have this woman as his wife. And so you kind of have this situation where they're saying, let's become one people, right? Let's become one family. And now Jacob has already kind of been in that position when he lived with Laban. And it didn't really go very well for him there when he lived with Laban, because Laban kept saying, well, this will be your wage or that will be your wage. And then he kept changing it. And he had a lot of trouble with that. But that's what they're offering here is we'll just blend our families into one, and then we'll share everything. And of course, Jacob is very wealthy, and so you kind of get the sense that maybe Hamor is seeing an opportunity here. He sees Jacob's wealth and says, let's turn this in our favor. But Jacob's sons have a different idea. And so verse 13, it says, "The sons of Jacob answered Shechem and Hamor his father, and they spoke deceitfully, because he had defiled Dinah their sister." And so this is one of those moments where you kind of say that the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And this is who Jacob was when he was young, and his sons have picked up on those. Jacob deceived people and to get what he wanted, and he tricked people. That's what his sons have picked up on. And so they said to him, "We cannot do this thing, to give our sister to one who is uncircumcised, for that would be a reproach to us. But on this condition we will consent to you. If you will become as we are, if every male of you is circumcised, then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to us, and we will dwell with you, and we will become one people. But if you will not heed us and be circumcised, then we will take our daughter, and we will be gone." And so the words pleased Hamor and Shechem, Hamor's son, and the young man did not delay to do the thing. Now this is really interesting what he says about him here. He says, talking about Shechem, the man who violated Dinah, he says, "He delighted in Jacob's daughter, and he was more honorable than all the household of his father."
But he raped that.
That's right. And so he is the most honorable person in this family. And so what Miss Tina is pointing out is they're clearly not great people. If he's the most honorable of all of them.
There's no way they did what they did themselves if they didn't think they would get more out of it than that.
That's right. Yeah. And so
Well, I would have done.
there's a great incentive beyond Dinah for those people to do that, and that's what they're fixing to talk about here. But yeah, it says he is the most honorable of all of them, and so you get the sense this is really a pretty wicked group of people that they're dealing with. And so Hamor and Shechem, his son, came to the gate of their city, and he spoke with the men of their city, saying, "These men are at peace with us. Therefore let them dwell in the land and trade in it, for indeed the land is large enough for them. And let us take their daughters to us as wives, and let us give them our daughters. Only on this condition will the men consent to dwell with us, to be one people, if every male among us is circumcised as they are circumcised." And then here's what Miss Tina is getting to, right? "Here are all the benefits that we received. Will not their livestock and their property, every animal of theirs, be ours? Only let us consent to them, and then they will dwell with us." And so all who went out of the gate of his city heeded Hamor and Shechem, his son. Every male was circumcised, all who went out of the gate of the city. In other words, if you go out of the gate, it's because you live there. And so they're saying all the men who lived there, they did this thing. And so it came to pass 3 days later, when they were in pain, that two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, and so you remember that they're all brothers, but a good chunk of them are half brothers. But these are two of her full brothers. These are Jacob and Leah's sons, Simeon and Levi. And so they especially took this personally. They say each took up his sword and came boldly upon the city and killed all the males. They killed Hamor and Shechem, his son, with the edge of the sword. They took Dinah from Shechem's house, and they went out. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city, because their sister had been defiled. And then they took their sheep, their oxen, their donkeys, what was in the city and what was in the field, and all the wealth, all their little ones and all their wives they took captive, and they plundered even all that was in the houses. And so this is why God tells us in Scripture, "Vengeance is mine," says the Lord. Because this is human nature is, You hurt me, I'm going to hurt you plus some what you did to me. And that's, which, I don't know how you, I'm glad that I'm not a judge of anything, because I don't know how you put an equal price on what they did. But you can see it, killing everybody and taking all of those women and children and all of that livestock is really a huge step from what they're dealing with there. And that's why, the world kind of misunderstands that phrase from Exodus chapter 21. And in Exodus 21 and verses 23 to 25, the law of Moses describes God's justice, and he says, it's an eye for an eye, it's a tooth for a tooth, and he has several phrases like that. Sometimes people, they say, well, that's so barbaric, just because someone made a mistake, you're gonna do this or that, and of course there's some element of they didn't always actually pluck people's eyes out or things like that, but the point of it is not to be barbaric, it's to be equal. If someone does this to you, if they steal your lamb, then they return your lamb to you, and there's an equalness to it. If they kill your lamb, then you get one of their lambs, or something like that. And so God wants that justice to be fitting. The punishment or the discipline should fit the crime. And so that's why if you take the life, then oftentimes the result was that you lose your life, or things like that. And so,
but there's some counter indicators here.
Yeah.
That we have to acknowledge. Number one, verse 2, several versions say violated.
Yes.
Or defiled.
Right.
Well, that can be consensual.
Yes.
And it's not really related that way if you look at all of the different translations, because
right.
Especially in the NASB, it says she was laid with by force. So she was raped. We need to understand that it was a rape situation.
Yes.
Not just two young people. And then we get the other counter indicator that he's the most honorable among them.
Exactly. Yeah.
So some of that kind of pulls together, and we're not sure we're not sitting here at the face of war.
Right. Yeah.
So kind of got to give them a little bit of slack for their.
No, I'm not judging them at all.
Yeah,
but
that's what I'm saying. There's some things there you think, whoa.
You can certainly sympathize with what they're thinking
I
there.
want to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
In that event, because she wasn't just tricked.
Yeah.
She was raped.
Right. But that's and you're absolutely right. There's really, as far as how it's explained in verse 2, there's no way to understand it where it's consensual for her, because if it was consensual, then they would have been married, because that's how they understood that arrangement. You go back to when Isaac married his bride, he took her into the tent and then they were married. And so the fact that she doesn't consider herself married to him tells you right away.
I just want to make sure we're clear.
Yes. Yeah.
Our understanding. This was not.
Right.
A Saturday night gone wrong.
Mm-hmm.
No, the really bad thing about that, though, is they kept the wives and children of the men they slain, and that means that they were going to be bringing in their gods and things like that
Yes.
right along with them, and they'd still have that plaguing them.
And we're going to see them deal with that in the next chapter. Yeah, but that's the trouble that Israel often deals with. Yeah. So yes, ma'am.
It seems to me kind of beneficial to them too. They did what he said, plus they took all their goods and everything that they had. They came out.
They came out ahead in a way.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that's all they had ever known. That's the way God dealt with things. He told them to go in, take the whole city, take everybody, get out of there.
Mm-hmm.
That's all they knew. And I don't think I think they were pretty smart. So.
Well, and that's I can't imagine how I would feel if I was them. But at any rate,
Come up and decide. I mean, they just painted a big target on their back.
yes, they certainly did.
Now we couldn't do that today because we're told. If they did it enough today, we wouldn't have as much trouble as we got now.
Yeah, sometimes it's harder to stick with God's word depending on what happens to you. But in any case, we know that Jacob himself was not happy about this. However they felt about it. Verse 30 tells us that Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, says, "You have troubled me by making me obnoxious among the inhabitants of the land, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites." And he says, "Since I am few in number, they will gather themselves together against me and kill me, and I shall be destroyed, my household in that." And so he says, right, now you've painted a target on our backs, and you've destroyed this entire town. And so all the towns around us are going to think that we're a problem, and I don't know what's going to happen moving forward. And so Jacob himself is very much not pleased about this situation, and they say, but should he have treated our sister like that? And so they feel justified in what they've done. And when you think about this story, and again, when you think about, well, why did Moses include this? Why is this here in place between him arriving in Canaan and him going on to Bethel? And again, this has everything to do with the people that he's writing to. That's here are these two sons of Jacob, and they do not have their father's approval to do what they do. But when they are in the Canaan land and they go to destroy a city, they have complete success. Now, the Israelites are supposed to go into the promised land, and now they have God's authority. There's no doubt about that. They have God's authority to destroy every city. If these guys can do it without even their father's approval, then shouldn't the Israelites be able to see with God's power, we definitely can do it? And that's Moses, once again, is always trying to show them that it is possible to succeed in what God has asked them to do. In every little step, he's given them more and more confidence that they can go into the land and conquer it, just as God has told them to. And in the same way that even today, we can say the same thing. We can say, whatever God has told us to do, if we have God behind us, then we know we can accomplish it because he has given us his blessing to do whatever it is that he's asked us to do. Yes?
There's two schools of thought about this too, where Jacob, he feared for his life now because of what's taking place. Some people think, well, with that kind of strength and might that they showed, ain't nobody gonna mess with them now.
Yeah.
So, we have the same school of thought today with our nuclear bombs and stuff. If we have that kind of power and threat to our country, they're not gonna tackle us for fear that we might tackle them unless we show weakness. And
right.
So it's the same thing going on today that was going on then.
Yeah. The world is eerily similar all the time, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, this is such a big deal to Jacob that these two boys are in his blessing at the end of his life. He essentially does not bless them, and he says, I don't even want to be associated with your name, and that's how big of a deal this was to Jacob.
Well, he's supposed to be, Jacob is the head of the family.
Right.
Anytime that anything like that was supposed to occur, they were always supposed to go to the head of the family to have, it's kind of like if we did something outside of the eldership.
Right.
I mean, we're supposed to look to the eldership, the person that's head, in this situation,
yeah.
Which would be Jacob. They were supposed to get his approval before they ever did anything that was, and they didn't.
Right. Yeah, I think
so,
that's a good point.
And especially back during this period of time, I mean, you just didn't do things unless you had the approval of
right.
the leader, whether it's a chieftain or.
Well, and that's sort of that Shechem also, he went and did things without his father's knowledge and approval, and it created problems. And so that's kind of a theme through this chapter. That's a good point. Yeah. And it does just kind of show you some of Jacob's growth as far as, when he was young, deception and whatever it took. And here he's disappointed in them for this. And so you can kind of see his changing. Kimmy?
I just had a question, why does it talk about, them coming to speak to Jacob, but it really only gives, his son's answers?
I kind of struggled through that too.
Not even there, not even giving an opinion.
Yes, I think that's a good point. And it's curious because it says in verse 7, or let's see here, I'm sorry, it's back in verse 5, that he heard about it, but he held his peace until the sons came. And to be honest, I kind of thought, and I don't really have a solid answer for you exactly.
Almost like he was allowing them to be
kind of take the lead there
of what was they felt.
And that could be the case, that he sort of, this is their sister, and so he's allowing them to sort of, practice. Jacob is, at this point, he's more than 100 years old.
I mean, I call them young sons.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah.
He's too old.
He may be sort of allowing them to sort of practice their leadership skills here, or to make this. That's a possibility. Yeah, I'm really not 100% sure what to make of Jacob's presence, but silence throughout this. But in the end, he was very dissatisfied with what they did choose. Whether he left the room because he figured it was solved, or whether he just allowed them to take the lead. Either way, he's dissatisfied. So that's a good thing to bring out. Yeah. All right. Oh wait, chapter 35 then. Chapter 35, Jacob fulfills his promise to the fullest. It says, God said to Jacob, arise, go up to Bethel and dwell there, and make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau your brother. And so go back to Jacob's ladder. Bethel is where he was when he had that dream. That's where Jacob promised to come back to build an altar. And so Jacob prepares his house to do that. And this is a common theme throughout all of Moses' writing. When you're approaching God, you don't do that flippantly. Right? Moses finds the burning bush, and what does God say? Take off your sandals. This is holy ground. There's something about approaching God. And so Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, put away the foreign gods that are among you, purify yourselves, and change your garments. And let us arise and go up to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and have been with me in the way which I have gone. And so we're putting away all these foreign gods. I don't know if he's found out about Rachel stealing her father's gods or not, but he has lots of servants. And then, of course, as Kenny pointed out, they've now taken on this whole new group of people, of women and children. And so he's telling them, put away those gods. He tells them to purify yourselves. They had certain kinds of sort of baths that they took sort of in preparation of religious things. And then change your garments. It's kind of like, put on your Sunday best. It's kind of the idea there. We're approaching God, and so let's look our best. And so he says, we're going to go to Bethel because this is the God who answered me in the day of my distress. This is the one who kept all of those promises. And so they gave Jacob all their foreign gods, which were in their hands, and the earrings, which are in their ears. Now, earrings, it's kind of like, do you remember when Abraham sent his servant to find a wife for Isaac, and when he found her, he put the nose ring, and that was that was kind of their engagement ring. They also had other kinds of earrings that were sort of symbolic of your commitment to a certain god. And so he's having them take those earrings out, sort of, I'm breaking off my relationship with my previous god, and they're giving those things to Jacob. And Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree, which was by Shechem. And so they bury it there. And they journeyed, and the terror of God was upon the cities that were all around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. And so Jacob was afraid that he was going to be a problem to everybody, that he was going to be attacked or followed. And it says the terror of God was on the people. Now, I don't know how, it doesn't tell us exactly how God accomplished that. Is it just that they heard, as Kenny suggested, is it just that they heard what happened to that town and they thought, these are people we don't want to mess with? Or did God come to them in dreams like they did to Laban and he said, leave these people alone? Or it doesn't tell us exactly how God accomplished it, but it just says that the terror of God was on them, and so they had very safe journey through there. And again, that's what it would say about the Israelites when they finally did go into the land, that the terror of God was on the people, and they did have battles along the way, but they were terrified of them. Remember what Rahab said in Joshua chapter 2? Joshua chapter 2, and starting in verse 9. She said, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God in heaven above and on the earth beneath. And so again, there's just this little reminder to Moses' people that in the Canaan land, God could strike terror in the hearts of these people. And if he could do it for Jacob, then he could do it for them too. And so he has safe passage. Verse 6 says that Jacob came to Luz, that's Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him. And he built an altar there and called the place El Bethel, because there God appeared to him when he fled from the face of his brother. And so he keeps that commitment, and the altar was so that he could sacrifice. He brought all of these animals and all of this back from Laban, and he's going to sacrifice some of that to God as a way of showing he knows that God is the source of all of that. And then in verse 8 it says that Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried below Bethel under the terebinth tree. And so the name of it was called Elon Bakthath. And so there's sort of an interesting parallel here, because twice in this chapter, things or people were buried underneath terebinth trees. You buried Deborah because she died, and so they buried her under the tree. And so what is it implying about the idols that they buried under the tree? They recognized that those idols were dead, that they had no power and no ability, because that's what they did. You take dead things, you put them under those trees. And so it's kind of this neat little parallel that he includes Deborah's death here to show us kind of what they're thinking about this. They recognized those idols were dead. They buried it, not so they could find it again later, right? And that's burying it would have desecrated them. To the ancient people, your idol should always, it's kind of like the American flag, you don't let it touch the ground, right? You take care of it. Your idol, you took care of it. If you put it under the ground, it was considered useless at that point. And so they're burying it because they recognize it's not the one with power. God has power. And so verse 9, God appeared to Jacob again, and he came from Padan Aram, when he came from Padan Aram, and blessed him. And God said to him, "Your name is Jacob. Your name shall not be called Jacob anymore, but Israel shall be your name." And so he sort of reiterates the name change. So he called his name Israel. And also God said to him, "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall proceed from you, and kings shall come from your body." And so that's, God promised Abraham many descendants. He's continuing that promise here. "The land which I gave Abraham and Isaac I give to you." And so that great land, it's continued to Jacob here. "And to your descendants after I give this land." And then God went up from him in the place where he talked with him. And Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he talked with him, a pillar of stone, and he poured a drink offering on it, and he poured oil on it, and Jacob called the name of the place where God spoke with him Bethel. And so he kind of has one last little sort of memorial stone there that he pours those offerings on, and he calls it Bethel. And so now he's fully returned to the promised land and has kept his promises to God and is the heir of all that Abraham was promised moving forward. So any thoughts or comments on what we've looked at here in chapter 35 so far? Okay. Then picking up in verse 16, then it says that they journeyed from Bethel, and when there was but a little distance to go to Ephrath, with Rachel labored in childbirth, and she had hard labor. And it came to pass when she was in hard labor that the midwife said to her, "Do not fear, you will have this son also." And so it was, as her soul was departing, for she died in childbirth, that she called his name Ben-Oni, and Ben-Oni means son of my sorrow. But his father called him Benjamin. And that's the second name change in this chapter. And there's sort of that parallel there. But Benjamin means son of the right hand. And so he's sort of saying, this is a son I'm going to keep right here. He's a son I'm going to keep right next to me. The right hand also kind of implies he'll be important, like a right hand man. He's going to be important in my family. And so Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. And those trees that they buried people under, those were in places that they lived. They looked for those trees. They built cities around them and such. But they're on a journey. They're on the road. They don't have a tree like that. And so in verse 20, he sets up a pillar. And that's the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. And then Israel journeyed and pitched his tent beyond the Tower of Eder. And it happened when Israel dwelt in that land that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard about it. And so, again, that's to lay with your father's concubine was a ancient sort of way of saying, I'm taking my father's place in the family. I'm usurping his authority. And that's what happens to King David when his son rebels against him. And that's what he's communicating here. And I kind of wonder if it's possible that he's doing that because he named Benjamin my right-hand son. And he knows that Rachel was the favorite wife. And later we see that they were jealous of Joseph for being the favorite son. And maybe Reuben is already concerned about losing his inheritance to Rachel's sons. And of course, this cost him his inheritance. Jacob says later, and so then it lists the 12 sons of Jacob, and he has all these sons. And then verse 27, Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, or Kirjath Arba, that is Hebron. So there's 3 names for that one place, where Abraham and Isaac had dwelt. And the days of Isaac were 180 years. And so I hope I don't live quite that long, but that's a long life. And Isaac breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people, being old and full of days. And his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. And so that the family is able to come back together. He sees his father again, and then his father dies, and the story continues with Jacob. And then it finishes in chapter 36. We're not going to read all of that genealogy, but it finishes by telling us a little bit about Esau when he was in Canaan. And then it says that he went ahead and moved on out of Canaan because Jacob's flocks were so big. And it's almost an Abraham-Lot situation where Esau recognizes Jacob is going to inherit. And so I'm going to go find kind of my own place in the world. I'm going to go find my own place to live. And so there are some things we could talk about there, but we're out of time, so we will wrap up. Any last thoughts or comments? All right, very good. Thank you for your attention.